a miracle, that this isn't something that we have recorded history of other people doing, coming back from the dead. So, and I think probably Mike anticipated that what I would say is that by definition, in history, a miracle is actually the least probable explanation for something. So that's just the way it works. Natural God intervening is sort of the last thing we look at. Now, that is not a method. We're not looking at historical naturalism here. We're not saying that because it's least likely that we say that miracles can't happen. I think it's entirely possible that miracles could happen. But unfortunately, when we look at history, that's the least likely thing. So if you want to tell us that a miracle happened, or if you want to prove that a miracle happened or convince us that it did, you would need a level of evidence that overcomes the burden that, I'm sorry, miracles, that's just the way life is for you. You have to overcome the burden of being the least likely thing that we could think about. So given, if there's two things that have equal explanatory power, you have the extraordinary claim, miracle claim, and a mundane claim, a historian, an honest historian, if there's equal explanatory power, would have to say the mundane claim is probably the most probable thing that happens, and that's all history can do, is tell us what's most likely. Now, Mike went through a number of facts. I'm glad he didn't go through quite as many as I thought he might, but I'm going to argue that there's really only, granted that I've granted the death, so that's fine. I really think there's only one fact that we're discussing here at all, and that is that people said Jesus rose from the dead. If people didn't say that, we wouldn't be here. So ultimately, we're looking at testimonial evidence. Now, if you're a historian and all you have is testimony, what would you prefer? What kind of testimony would you like? Well, you would obviously like first-hand testimony. First-hand is better than second-hand, third-hand, fourth-hand. You'd also prefer to have contemporary testimony. You'd prefer that the person who's talking about it was either there or lived around the same time as what he's talking about, as opposed to someone generations later. You'd prefer to have multiple accounts rather than fewer accounts. Obviously, the more accounts you have, the better attested something is, and we'll talk about that a bit. You'd prefer that your sources were independent. You'd rather have sources that couldn't have corroborated, that weren't going from the same experience. You'd like to have, even though you'd like them to be independent, you would prefer if that evidence would corroborate each other. You'd prefer that when multiple people talk about something, that they're getting the details the same, or at least close to the same on the main points. And lastly, you'd like that testimony to be unbiased. You'd prefer that the person who's giving the testimony doesn't care one way or the other, has no vested interest in what's happening here. You'd prefer, obviously, the witness to an accident. You'd prefer it be the bystander on a street rather than one of the drivers. So, that's kind of testimony that people would like. So obviously, yeah, I would agree. The Bible is not one book. It's rightfully so 66 books, and we're speaking though specifically about 4 or 5 here. The main one that most people get their evidence about the resurrection from is the Gospels. Now, when we evaluate the Gospels in light of the kind of testimony people would like, we start with the fact that they're anonymous. We have no idea who wrote the Gospels. We have traditions that came later, but the Gospel writers didn't sign the books. And again, I would appeal to, that's the scholarly consensus. Well, in fact, it's not even scholarly consensus. You can read the books yourself. They don't name themselves. Also, if you read the book yourselves, you'll notice none of them even claim to be firsthand witnesses. There's no verse in there that's in any of the Gospels that says, I saw this, which is a weird voice to use. I'm sorry, I didn't use that. The Gospel writers aren't firsthand witnesses. They don't claim to be. And are the Gospels contemporary? Well, I think even the people who are very aggressive at early dating will put Mark, which is the first Gospel, written around 65 AD, which is 32 years after the crucifixion was supposed to have happened. Well, given the lifespans at that age and time in the first century in Rome, lifespan was around 30 years. So we're talking about a full lifespan past when the events happened. You're talking about John, you're talking about 95 AD up to 120 AD, depending on how you date it. These are generations after the events. So, these Gospels aren't necessarily, they don't do well against these criteria. additionally, fun fact, the original book of Mark doesn't even have post-resurrection appearances, so it almost doesn't even count for that. Again, they're not independent. I think Mike agreed with me that 97% of Mark. So Mark was written first, and Matthew and Luke borrowed heavily. In fact, 97% of Mark is duplicated in Matthew, 88% of Mark is duplicated in Luke, and specifically, I know there's Q and there's other sources, but specifically, the post-resurrection appearances seem to be most borrowed from Mark, including almost some of it word for word. If you look at the original Greek, and where there is differences, they seem to be theological in nature. I better hurry up. And there's also evidence that John used Mark. So these are not the kind of independent sources you'd want. The other problem is they don't corroborate. Now, I would never say that the fact that there's contradictions in the Bible proves or disproves the resurrection of Jesus, but if we're talking about evaluating a source and do they corroborate with each other, they vary on points that can't really be reconciled. Did Jesus die before or after the Passover? Did the women tell anyone about Jesus resurrecting or not? How did Judas die? Where did Peter see resurrected Jesus for the first time? These are all points on which the Gospels do not agree. Now, I don't think that's necessarily evidence, but it does definitely should knock down your confidence level in these sources as good witnesses when the fact that they can't agree on some of these very basic points. And the truth is, where they differ, it actually seems to not be because they're writing history, but because they're writing theology. So, for example, John seems to have moved the time of the death of Jesus so that he could make Jesus be the Passover lamb that most of his book wants to talk about. They were playing very fast and loose with any details they happen to have. These are actually not intended to be historical books. We might look at extra-biblical. I noticed Mike didn't talk about extra-biblical, but if I'm going to briefly address those, we actually have no one outside of the Gospels who say they saw Jesus alive. We have, at best, people who talked about what Christians believed happened, but again, we don't have any sources outside of these ones, so we're kind of stuck. We have these circumstantial... Sorry?
You got 1 minute left.
Mm-hmm. Okay, 1 minute. Let me skip ahead. So the one person we have who named things is... I got 2 minutes. Oh, well. One person who said that they saw Jesus and gave them a name was Paul. But Paul didn't see Jesus. Paul saw a vision. If you look at the thing in Acts, the companions didn't see what he saw. They didn't hear what he heard. This was after the ascension, so Jesus would have had to come back. That would have had to have been the second thing. Paul saw a hallucination, which is a mundane explanation. And as we're going to talk about, mundane explanations supersede the others. We'll talk, I think, in our back and forth about the 1 Corinthians 15 creed. Again, that is really just testimony to what people said happened, as Mike said. It's not testimony to what actually did happen. So we're looking at the veracity of this claim. And we look at these witnesses and say, are they telling the truth? Yeah, maybe they're telling the truth. Another option is no, they're not telling the truth. They're actually out and out lying. We obviously know that that's a possibility. The other thing is, could be possible is no, they're mistaken. They thought they were telling the truth, but they weren't. The second of those two, that they're lying or that they're mistaken, are extremely mundane claims. So again, when we're talking about the mundane, that has to be taken into consideration from history well ahead of anything that's supernatural. And what we don't have, testimony does not lead us to much. Anyway, testimony doesn't lead us to conclude something miraculous when we have mundane claims at hand. And I will end there.
Perfect. Steve, do you hear that feedback? Or is that just me?
It's not like a train or something, but it's gone now, or like a rumbling, but it seems
it's getting lower. Okay. Excellent job. Well, let me ask, do one of you have something going on in the background just so that we can go ahead and...
I don't think so.
All I have is I have a little fan. That's about it.
That might be what it is. Okay. I don't hear it as much anymore. All right, so you guys, I think, laid out a excellent starting point. There's a lot of ground to cover there, I think. A lot of points were kind of put out. So since we just ended with Paul, Mike will start the discussion off with you, and you can kind of, I guess, pick a point there or however you want to go, and then it's you guys' show from now on.
Great. Okay, so tons of stuff, right, from both me and from you. And so then the debate now in my head is like, where do we go from here? So let me just come back to what I think are the most important issues, which is this. I gave 3 what I say are consensus facts, and then a 4th one that is a majority that I think we have a really solid case for.
Yeah, and I would actually compliment you that those first 3 facts I would generally agree with you.
Okay, that was my first question. So do you agree with those 3 facts?
Well, you gave good wording, so let me just go through the first of them. So obviously, I'm willing to if Jesus died, I'm willing to say, or if Jesus existed, he died. Like, that's easy to grant. So we can sort of skip over the first one.
Well, it's more specific than that, because it's important that he died by crucifixion. That's part of what assures us that this wasn't a swoon. This wasn't like he didn't get revived a few days later.
Sure, and swoon theory, I don't know why you keep using that. It's kind of a thing that hasn't been popular for a century, but yes,
I'm going to keep it not popular.
That's all right. Sounds good. No, so I'm with you. So I think that we have enough evidence from Tacitus and Josephus for me willing to say, yeah, he died at the hand of Pontius Pilate. That probably that happened. So I grant you that one exists.
Okay.
You phrased the other one I thought was that the disciples believed that he was resurrected, and that they believed that they saw appearances. So that's also easy to grant. I think that now the only quibble I would have there is which disciples do you mean? So how many of them do you think? So I would agree that obviously if you count Paul as one of them, Paul definitely believed he saw it. No, actually, that was your third point, Paul. So we'll leave.
That was the third fact.
So
because he wasn't a disciple.
Sure. Yeah. So we have Peter, who went on to do things that we're well aware of. Do you think that we have great attestation that any of the other 12 believe this?
So, okay. First, let me just say this: this is not a fact that is debated really outside of the conversation we're having. So, are you saying that you dispute number 2?
No, I would say. I would say if you said that 12 disciples believed that he was I'd say this. I would dispute that. But if you're just saying some disciples, so I would grant you probably that James and that maybe Jude and that Peter. Those are the ones that are well attested. The others, depends on where.
So you say goes. James?
I'm not completely.
You said James, Jude, and Peter are well attested?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So James and Jude, brothers of Jesus, not original disciples. Those are actually great to add to my case. So James and Jude, brothers of Jesus, who did not believe in him while he was, doing his ministry on earth, and they actually razzed him, and it seems wanted him to get killed, and then and thought he was crazy, according to the gospel accounts. And then later, they had some kind of appearance. So they kind of are more, like in that category of non-believers who became believers, probably as a result of whatever they thought they saw.
Talk about the other. So obviously, Judas doesn't count because he didn't see resurrected Jesus. So then you're down to 10 people that we don't really have much attestation that they went around claiming this. And the reason why this is important to me is because, people talk about, do we need mass hallucinations and do we need a giant conspiracy and stuff? And it's like, well, no, it's really just a couple of disciples who we know really well were going out and preaching this stuff. We don't have great ideas of what Bartholomew and Matthew and all those guys were out saying. We have good attestation for Peter. We have good attestation for Paul. So all I'm saying is that. Go ahead.
So you say Peter, you say Paul. In the same places where you say we have good attestation for Peter and Paul, 1 Corinthians 15 is probably the chief passage for that for pretty much everybody, right? That is actually the same passage where it says that he also appeared to the 12. So he appeared to Peter and to the 12.
So let's talk about. I'm just going to jump so we can go back to 1 Corinthians 13. I want to say, absolutely, Peter or Paul believed he saw. I'm going to give you number 3, absolutely, that Paul about everybody thinks he saw Jesus. I'll fully grant that. But I don't think he actually did.